Hello, my name is Andrew Keen. Welcome to Keen on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. Back in March of 2023, we did a show with the writer Jeffrey Stern on a new book, back then, at least in March of 2023, that he had out. It was called The Mercenary, Story of Brotherhood and Terror in the Afghan War. It was very much a book about war on the ground, its terrors and its tragedies, and perhaps its inspiration. Jeffrey Stern is back with a new kind of book. It's called The Warhead. Rather than the history of people, it's a history and an analysis of what some people thought of or think of as the perfect weapon. Jeffrey is joining us from Las Vegas. Jeffrey, how did you get from The Mercenary to The Warhead? Was it a logical progression?
Probably not. I had written an article about the air campaign in Yemen and one particular airstrike on a village in northern Yemen. And editors and I were trying to figure out essentially how to get people to care about faraway place where there was this massive crisis happening. And one of the ideas we came up with was, let's track one of the weapons from a place that we're all more familiar with, in this case, Tucson, Arizona, where kind of normal people with names like ours are putting these weapons together, and then it's shipped overseas eventually to the Gulf and then dropped on Yemen. And in the process of trying to figure out the origins of this bomb, we found that it was invented by Texas Instruments originally. Texas Instruments I'd only known of as the calculator company. And so it seemed like there was a little bit more there. So what we came up with was this idea to turn that article essentially into a book that was more or less a biography of this thing, of this weapon, and using a weapon whose purpose largely is kind of disconnection, both in a physical bodily sense, but also in the way that remote war allows us to sort of engage enemies from further and further away, to use this thing almost as a character that's kind of reconnecting people all over the world in various conflicts that this thing was used in.
Jeffrey, don't need me to tell you, more and more concern about AI and smart machines of one kind or another. We've done lots of shows on this increasingly intimate relationship between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. There was a book a year ago, Unit X, that got shortlisted for the Financial Times Book of the Year about this relationship between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley. Is that the subtext of this book, The Warhead, a concern and an analysis, a history of smart weapons?
It is. I would say it is a subtext. It is a kind of fascinating interconnection between both technologies of war in the Pentagon, obviously, but also consumer technologies. And in the case of this particular weapon, it's a smart bomb called Paveway, relatively cheap, relatively easy to use, relatively simple in how it works. But one of the things that this weapon did for the company that invented it was it served essentially as wrapping paper, as like packaging for what was the first silicon semiconductor. Texas Instruments had made a big bet on trying to make a transistor out of silicon. This is sort of what became the genesis of the personal computing revolution, but had to find a way to bring the cost down low enough that it could eventually find consumer uses. And one of the ways that they stumbled on to do that was weapons. Another way was the calculator. So there's a sort of interesting thing where the nerds in high school, basically, and the Air Force are both helping Texas Instruments to bring the cost of this thing down low enough that we can eventually end up with like iMacs and PowerBooks and iPhones.
The book is about this relationship between Texas Instruments and the Pentagon, and Texas Instruments' development of the Paveway smart weapon. What does this tell us about the military-industrial complex? Of course, a term invented by Eisenhower in the 1950s, increasingly dominating perhaps both military and civil industry in America. Does it suggest a rather troubling, morally at least troubling coalition?
Yeah, although I think that with Paveway and with smart weapons, it's sort of a sub chapter of the military industrial complex. It's one of the things that I find really worth honing in on and holding in your mind for a second about smart weapons in particular is that, first of all, they are invented arguably as much to solve a political problem as a strategic and tactical problem. At the time that the Paveway first came online, we were trying to bomb really precise targets in Vietnam, heavily defended. Pilots were getting were getting shot down. One of the reasons for that was because of really restrictive rules of engagement. You weren't allowed to shoot at MiGs, the Russian fighter jets, when they were on the ground. You could only do it when they were up in the air, and when they were therefore obviously much more dangerous. Similar thing with surface-to-air missile sites. This was because there was fear that there'd be Russian or Chinese advisors nearby, and if a little collateral damage could escalate the war. One of the reasons why pilots were in such a dangerous predicament then was because of these rules of engagement. And one of the things this weapon allowed them to do was hit precise targets from further away, which obviously has a tactical advantage, but it was as effective at solving a political problem. Now, more recently, these weapons make a really compelling argument for their own use because there's this concept of geographic engineering where certain weapon systems are built and part of them are assembled in almost every congressional district, which makes them very hard to cancel as contracts. This weapon, because it's ostensibly so precise, it's inexpensive, it's ostensibly safer for us to use. It also is sort of a compelling argument for its own use when we might otherwise not engage in some foreign conflict. If we had to acknowledge that we were going to cause a lot of destruction, the people who are assembling them, they're largely union jobs or security clearance jobs, which means they can't be outsourced. And then even when it comes to selling them to foreign countries, there's a compelling argument that, wouldn't you rather be in the room with these other countries to make sure they're using them in a humane way? Wouldn't you rather have a foot in the door? Wouldn't you rather they not go to Russia or China to get their weapons? So there is an immense amount of inertia for these things to continue to get built, used, and sold to allies.
A couple of years ago, of course, the Oppenheimer movie came out. Lots of discussion about the morality of warfare. Sounds to me, from the way you're describing Paveway in The Warhead, rather than these weapons or the people building them being somehow evil, there's a kind of banality about the whole thing. Is there a corporate banality? Is there a moral equivalency, if you like, between Texas Instruments building a calculator and building a smart weapon? Is there in your book a moral critique, at least implicitly, of Texas Instruments?
That's a really good question, and it's something I thought about more towards the end of the book. In Oppenheimer, there's that exchange, which by all accounts actually happened, where Niels Bohr comes to the Manhattan Project. He's visiting, and he asks Oppenheimer, "Is it big enough?" And Oppenheimer says, "To end the war." And Niels Bohr says, "No, to end all war." And there's a similar thing that happened with Alfred Nobel when he's invented dynamite. And in his correspondence, you can see him saying things like, "This thing that my factories," this is obviously not a direct quote, but paraphrasing, "this weapon that my factories are building will be so awful that all armies will lay down their arms and war will cease to exist." I think there's this neat psychological trick you're able to tell yourself where I think very few people are inventing weapons thinking like, I want to kill more people and hurt more people. It's often almost the opposite. I'm inventing a tool of salvation and of humanity. I'm inventing a more precise weapon that is going to spare civilians. And the people at Texas Instruments that I talked to, and those that I didn't, but whose sort of stories I retold, are, to a person, people you would trust your kids with. They are humane, conscientious people. They are trying to solve engineering problems. They are very conscious of the problems the military is facing, but also the problems that 18-year-old privates are trying to fight wars without the right equipment are facing. People on the ground are facing with not precise with weapons that are indiscriminate. And I've tried to set the book up so that you're seeing these problems and the people who are in danger because they don't have the tool, so that by the time you see the really devastating effects that these things can have on civilians, you're already kind of halfway through and kind of invested. And rather than being able to say, oh, these avaricious C-suite defense executives who are such terrible people who did this, you sort of realize it's a lot of good intentions. It's a lot of sort of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And a lot of these people really were presented with problems, were presented with people at risk because of these problems, and were trying to solve them. So the effects are obviously ambiguous, might be a way to put it, but it's not because people set out to sort of make as much money hurting as much people as they can. It's not exactly the opposite, but it's closer to the opposite.
The subtitle of the book, Jeff, and don't need me to tell you this, is The Quest to Build the Perfect Weapon in the Age of Modern Warfare. Sometimes publishers come up with subtitles. I'm not sure why and how Paved Way is more or less of a perfect weapon than any other. What's so perfect, or what was seen as so perfect about it?
Well, I think it's a wise point that publishers often help with subtitles, but to me, there's sort of two things happening. One is it's obviously a bit of a chaotic quest here. Like, can you build a perfect weapon? Of course not. We're always trying to, and there's an illusion that.
Or shall we say, I mean, the idea of a perfect weapon is, of course, a contradiction in terms. It's probably a better description would be a better way of putting it: an imperfect weapon that kills as many people as you possibly can.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Would be perhaps a more descriptive subtitle. But I do think there are ways in which you could describe this as kind of the platonic ideal of a weapon as we as a defense industrial complex perceive it, which is easy to use, very precise, ostensibly very humane. And
what do you mean? I have to jump in there. I get into trouble for interrupting, Jeff, but ostensibly humane, how can a weapon be ostensibly humane?
Okay, so one way is that if I tell you I have this weapon and you're going to be able to hit the terrorist leaders that you're trying to go after, and you're not going to hurt anyone else. And I mean, these weapons are as precise in pure, the way we evaluate it is circular error probability. Like, they are more precise in that the thing that you are aiming a laser at, it is very likely to hit very close to that. However, for example, the most precise weapon is still only as precise as the intelligence on the ground. And exactly. You're using a weapon to go someplace and engage somewhere where you can't otherwise, because, for example, you don't have a massive military presence, or in the case of Iraq, Libya, other places we've used these, we essentially have no intelligence presence on the ground, or even a working embassy where we can have people under diplomatic cover. The other thing, though, is that one of the examples I use is the second Iraq War, the second Gulf War, which has been called the most precise air war in history. And by proportion of precision munitions used, that kind of does hold up. And yet it's been one of the most devastating. It was one of the most devastating conflicts for civilians. And by some metrics, within 6 months or a year, more civilians have been killed with precise weapons than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings combined. So that's sort of why we use the term ostensible, because by 1-to-1 in terms of an anecdote, it is precise, but in terms of its effect on how and when and where we engage, its effect is different, and you could argue, I think, less humane, because it allows the veneer, it allows us to tell ourselves a story that isn't always accurate.
Yeah, and this comes back to where we began with this crossover between The Mercenary, which is a story on the ground of the Afghan war, and this history of the warhead. Presumably, you've seen in your time in Afghanistan or Iraq, you've seen Paved Way in action. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And describe the experience. What's it like as a journalist, someone on the ground, seeing these supposedly precise weapons, these supposedly perfect weapons in action?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that, because when you write about these things, or you cover the defense industry from the US or UK, you see these things assembled, and they're very sleek, and they look very modern and precise. And it's easy to forget that somewhere they're always exploding, and an explosion is an explosion. Um, one of the things, and I write this in the author's note because this is sort of the formative experience in going about this project, was in northern Yemen, um, telling the story of this one airstrike and meeting some of the villagers who had been victims of it. And there was one person in particular who had me touch his face because he still had pieces of shrapnel like lodged in skin beneath his eye, and it struck me because it had been so hard to get there. It had been so hard to get to northern Yemen, but it had been so easy for this weapon to get there. Um, so there is and I think this is sort of what I'm speaking of when I talk about the disconnect. It's war can often feel more like a video game to those of us prosecuting it, sitting in a air conditioned trailer in an Air Force base, launching a drone strike on a with black and white infrared readout or whatever, and the intense destruction that even a relatively precise small weapon can cause, not just in its intended effects, but there's an overpressure wave and people's organs collapse. There's shrapnel that's flying at thousands of miles per hour that's can disassemble human bodies. And I remember even picking up pieces of the bomb, at way after it detonated, and this high ferritic iron. It's these little pieces that are not much bigger than pebbles and are so heavy, and you can imagine this extremely heavy thing flying at thousands of miles per hour and how vulnerable a human body is to that. So the kind of severity and the intensity of the effect of, again, even one of our smaller and more precise weapons is just so extreme and so easy to lose sight of if you're not there on the ground when these things go off.
So I'm not entirely sure what your moral argument is or isn't. On the one hand, you talk about the terrible toll of these weapons. On the other hand, and correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to be suggesting that the guys who built it and developed it at Texas Instruments are mid-level corporate types, scientists, developers, account managers, who are only doing their best. Is there a moral narrative here, or is perhaps the tragedy of this history of the perfect weapon that it's actually very, very hard to establish any kind of moral accountability one way or the other?
Yeah, I think that is it. It is hard to. I think to me it is perhaps a shortcut to try to apply moral accountability to one or two people, and I think that the the reason why there is not a villain, there is not this big bad executive who's living in a mansion because he's killing people. Um, the reason that's not, I think, true, and certainly in the book, I'm not trying to find those people, is because it is a bit. I think it is a bit more of a complex problem, and I think we are a little bit more complicit in it as civilians and voters, than we perhaps like to be. And again, I think that's the reason that is the reason why I structured the book in a way that I ideally the reader is kind of rooting for this thing to be invented because they're seeing the reason to invent it. They're seeing the people who are in danger because they don't have the right tool for the job, and that by the time you begin to see how devastating the effect is on civilians, you're almost halfway through the book, and it's too late to look around and try to be like, well, if we just didn't have this kind of person, we'd be fine, or just that person's fault, because that's not reality. And I think, as we were talking about military industrial complex, and I was describing how compelling this particular weapon is at making an argument for its own use, um, that's part of why I'm not trying to lay blame on any one particular person, because I think that's not the reality, and I also think that's not really a helpful way to look at this problem, because the reality is it's not like there's one person where if we could hold that person accountable, this whole complex would cease to exist. It is a very entrenched um, system with a lot of momentum, and that's not to say that it's impossible to correct. But we'd be to if you can excuse a poor analogy here, like we'd be a little bit off target if we focused all our energy on trying to stop one company's inventors from trying to solve what they see as either engineering problems or tactical and strategic problems. That's not what's gonna allow us to sort of see the real impact on these things. And I think
yeah, no, I take your point, and I appreciate your honesty and moral bravery, actually, Jeffrey, in not creating a Doctor Strangelove in your narrative who's evil. But in a way, then, are you creating a pass for not just Texas Instruments, but the modern technology companies of warfare? Everyone from Google now are in trouble over their AI and use in the Middle East, to Silicon Valley companies like Palantir?
Yeah, perhaps. I think that's a fair criticism. I think my hope would be, and this is I say this with a fair amount of humility. I mean, I'm very conscious of the fact that the best, for example, investigative reporting doesn't necessarily stop the big company from poisoning the water. But I think that some of the people that are important to reach are those people, are those technology companies. I think there's very few people working on advancing AI now who are saying, hopefully we can build more destructive weapons. I mean, they're talking about healthcare problems and solving the climate crisis. And I think that one of the ways that we can begin to slow the perversion of technology into weapons of destruction is by meeting people where they are, and bring them a little bit on a narrative of how things that they might be working on with the best of intentions can be corrupted. So I think one fair criticism is giving technology companies a pass. Would hope that there'll be a few people who begin reading and can identify with the problems that these inventors and engineers are trying to solve, and can eventually see where that ends up. And perhaps that's where, I'm not going to be able to walk into OpenAI and tell them, guys, slow down, this is dangerous. But maybe people at OpenAI can read something where they can see a little bit of themselves and establish, a little bit of a break, or at least a bit of introspection, seeing how other people, like them, with mostly good, pure intentions, ended up creating something that's been responsible for so much death and destruction and suffering.
Yeah, and that, of course, goes back to a lot of the themes in Oppenheimer. Jeff, we had another Jeffrey on the show a few months ago, Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of AI, and he warned about the potential for AI to wipe us out. And one of his solutions, actually, was to make AI acquire a kind of female voice. I wasn't entirely convinced, but actually, talking to you, I wonder whether in your research for the Warhead, particularly in Texas Instruments, whether this is very much of a male preoccupation, a male project. Were there women involved at Texas Instruments, or was this very much of a boys' game?
It was very much of a boys' game. There are some interesting ways that women intersect with the story of Paveway. One of them is that when the company was working on the second version, and trying to essentially maximize the efficiency of the workforce, they did a bunch of research and found things like fine motor skills and hand-eye coordination that women tended to have an advantage, and especially women in a certain age group, and began trying to put more and more women on the assembly line for certain parts of the weapon. But in terms of overseeing the projects and doing a lot of the engineering, initially that was largely Texas Instruments, until a little bit after Raytheon acquired the company and the assembly line got all disorganized, and a woman came in for Raytheon and helped to kind of whip the assembly line into shape. This was in the early 2000s, and part of the reason why Raytheon was able to catch up and supply the war on terror was because of women who were overseeing the engineering and assembly line. But yes, to your point, it was a largely male-dominated enterprise in terms of inventing the weapon.
Although maybe that's a message we should give to Geoffrey Hinton, that women are just as complicit as men when it comes to manufacturing or perfecting these weapons. If Raytheon was able to catch up with Texas Instruments because of more efficient women on the assembly line, it suggests that we should trust women no more or less than men when it comes to moral accountability. Perhaps. Tricky. Yeah. It's all very tricky. You noted earlier, Jeff, that we all have a responsibility, all Americans. And I wouldn't necessarily say that the story of the warhead, this supposedly perfect weapon, Paveway technology developed by Texas Instruments, is as American as apple pie. But certainly all the classic American companies and mythologies were involved, everything from the Disney company, Walt Disney, to the Kennedy family. So is your narrative, your history of the warhead, very much of an American story, for better or worse?
Yeah, I think so. And I was drawn to the kind of Forrest Gump way that this thing that few of us have ever heard of has sort of appeared either center stage or far backstage, but somewhere in all these kind of well-known names and establishments in the American constellation of sort of popular culture. So I do think it is a very American story, and I think that the idea of we're going to invent a new thing and solve a problem, and in so doing, perhaps create a suite of new problems, is also perhaps kind of a very American.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Forrest Gump, of course, remarkable movie in which Gump himself, one of the key chapters was his involvement in the Vietnam War. Explain how Disney and the Kennedys were actually involved with Pathway. Were they consciously involved, or were they innocent bystanders, so to speak?
They were not consciously involved in Paveway in particular. Their innocence is well, I'll tell you. So the story of how Kennedy is involved is in two ways. The main way is that one of the first attempts at a self-guided weapon was during the very tail end of World War II, when Hitler was building a new version of his vengeance weapons in Nazi-occupied France. And the US and UK were trying to figure out a way to destroy this bunker where these weapons were being built before it could come online. They realized that they could not get enough firepower close enough while still, getting home safely. And one of the solutions was, well, what if we remove getting home safely from the equation? And they came up with this idea to use war-weary bombers, equip them with robot levers and hands and television cameras, take off, pack them with torpedo explosives, take off, and then steer them with a mothership kind of guiding by remote into the target. So kind of a kamikaze drone. They realized was they could kind of figure out how to steer this thing into a target remotely, but taking off was still too complicated a maneuver to do just by a couple of rods and levers. So they needed people, they needed pilots to take off in these flying bombs essentially, and then parachute out. And Joe Kennedy, the eldest Kennedy's son, who was he was the one destined to be the first Catholic president. He was sort of this golden child. He volunteered for this mission, and essentially the plane, this giant bomb, detonated before he could get out. That's the prologue of the book, and one of the reasons we start there is because this again was sort of, if you could imagine a morally unambiguous mission, this was sort of it. I mean, it was a mission to destroy a Nazi weapon so that it couldn't destroy London. And it was part of the prologue, both in the book and in real life, of the attempts to build a self-steering bomb that ultimately led to Paveway. The way that
it's really interesting, because the way I've always read the Joe Kennedy death was, it was a suicide mission. But are you suggesting it wasn't?
No, not intentionally.
But the chances were very, very high that he was going to die.
It was certainly dangerous, but they had practiced the maneuver of going up in the plane and parachuting out. Parachuting out was not without risks. It was parachuting at a speed that it had rarely been done before. But no, it was the expectation. Of course, it was dangerous. He was flying in a plane packed with like 30,000 pounds of explosives. But the expectation was not that they would die.
And the way I've always read this is that Joe Kennedy was trying to keep up with his brother, his younger brother, Jack, who was already a war hero.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, especially because, Jack had always been this sort of sickly kid who mostly just complained and was never, Joe was never threatened by him until very recently, until in this one new Enterprise war, Joe didn't have as much success as his younger brother, who at that point was, had become a war hero already. And there's a bit of a, I think, kind of crisis of conscience, and I need to do something now to sort of prove my own mettle.
Yeah, often people talk about JFK as the perfect president, so maybe there's a connection between the perfect president and the perfect weapon. What about the Disney Corporation? It's not a name I would expect to come up in the development of a perfect weapon.
Yeah, so this is a little bit peripheral, but one of the people who was responsible for designing Hitler's vengeance weapon was a Nazi rocket scientist who came to the U.S. after World War II as part of Operation Paperclip, when we sent intelligence officers over to recruit Nazi scientists, both in order for us to kind of retain their expertise and also to make sure they didn't fall into the hands of the Russians. Werner von Braun was one of the rocket scientists who'd been responsible for designing a lot of the vengeance weapons, and who had been relocated to Redstone, Alabama, to work on modifying the vengeance weapons to turn into rockets that we could actually use, and ultimately did. The vengeance weapons evolved into the Mercury rocket that took the Apollo missions to space, and into the Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles. But for a while, it was really hard for those scientists to get the rocket to land anywhere in particular, because Hitler hadn't needed them to. He wanted weapons that could sort of destroy London. It didn't really matter where they landed. And as you're launching these test rockets and trying to figure out how to get them to steer, using signal actuators, using vacuum tubes, these sort of big, heavy germanium glass things, and burning up a bunch of them with every test flight, the people overseeing scientists realized they needed another way to take in signals and get these things to steer. It was around that time that guy who was working with Werner von Braun and the scientists at Redstone came across Texas Instruments at an electronics conference, I think it was, and saw that they'd been doing this work on these things called transistors, on silicon semiconductors. And through that kind of marriage, Texas Instruments began supplying chips essentially to the Nazi rocket scientists, Werner von Braun and the others in Redstone, and realized that this is a way that we can bring the cost of these things down low enough that we might spark a consumer market. And part of the reason that Werner von Braun, who was this Nazi scientist working with the Americans at the Redstone Arsenal, was so effective as a communicator and as a kind of advocate for what they were doing, was because Walt Disney tapped him to hold a series of television shows as Walt Disney was trying to market this new thing that he'd built out in Thousand Oaks, trying to take advantage of the interstate highways, the new interstate highways, what became Disney World. And there was part of it called Tomorrowland. Werner von Braun would get up and talk about, the space race and how we get to the moon and rocket science. And he became one of the more famous people in America, one of the early sort of television celebrities, which allowed him to sort of more effectively advocate for the rockets they were building.
Yeah, it's again, this whole thing could have been written by Thomas Pynchon or Don DeLillo. Well, although I think it'd be fair to call him an ex-Nazi. I'm not sure he was still a Nazi when he was associated with Disney or the defense industry. You noted earlier, Jeff, that these weapons are always limited, however quote unquote perfect they are, always limited by the imperfection of human beings and using them in the wrong way. What's your take on AI and weaponry and drones and the ability now to fight wars without human beings? Is that conceivable? What does the history of the warhead and Paveway tell us, teach us, or perhaps warn us about such quote unquote idealistic visions of wars without humans?
It is certainly conceivable. It's already possible. I think there's a few lessons from Paveway. One is that these technologies, I think, are always way more impressive to look at than they are in practice. Not to say that the promise of these technologies is impossible and we will never realize the ideal of a perfect autonomous weapon. But Paveway looks very slick and modern and kind of authoritative when you look at it, and yet can still blow up a family full of people celebrating weddings in Pakistan or whatever because they missed the target or we have bad intelligence. AI, I find just in general is a lot like that. It's of course extremely impressive and probably revolutionary, and also tends not to be as good as it can look at first glance. That is uh, a very kind of chilling thing when you think of weapons. I mean, it can be very convincing when you have a whole technological system saying, "That's the terrorist. We're ready to strike. Do you want us to do it?" Um, which I think is also a very real problem we're facing now, because we do have the capability. We're already equipping armed drones with supercomputers that are able to collapse the kill chain down into essentially a few seconds, uh, looking for targets, nominating targets for engagement, making the decision to strike, and striking. There's a Defense Department directive that says something to the effect of, there will always be a meaningful level of human engagement in any decision to strike. Um, it's not, I think, clear to me, and perhaps a little bit clearer to lawyers, but I'm not sure what exactly meaningful level of human engagement is. But there's this way of framing it that experts in the Defense Department uses, where we talk about human in the loop, human out of the loop, and then human on the loop. So human in the loop is there's a person who's involved in the decision to strike. Human out of the loop means a human is not, and human on the loop means a human is not necessary, but we'll check with a human, and that's kind of where we're pretty much at. And that seems like a good way to sort of put a break on just unrestricted strikes. But I think you could imagine that if you have a young private or whatever sitting behind a computer bay, and the entire system is saying that's the terrorist, the entire defense apparatus is aligned to strike this thing. Do you, son, want to stop this? There's an immense amount of pressure not to. And as the pressure to engage increases, the mechanism to stop it becomes thinner, and the time to stop it becomes thinner. Then there's an immense amount of momentum towards more and more strikes. And there is not really a corresponding increase in the technology or the availability of ways to stop strikes. So it's not a perfect analogy, but you think of like the Patriot missile. We have these defense systems which can stop various kinds of larger weapons, but they're as expensive as they were before. They're as hard to make, and there's not a corresponding increase in an anti-pave way as there is pave way. There's not a corresponding increase in anti-AI weapons as there is AI weapons. So we're canted in this posture of having more and more easier and easier to deploy weapons that require less and less human engagement. And there'll be more pressure to use them, and more corresponding pressure on the other side to use them too, out of fear that we won't get the chance if we don't strike now.
Incredibly morally complex, imperfect, I think, rather than perfect. The Warhead by Jeffrey Stern, an author, historian, a war correspondent. Jeffrey, it's clear finally that we should all be reading this book and learning about, I guess, our own indirect complicity. But what would you want a policymaker, a senior person at the Pentagon, if they were to read this book, or a senior person at Palantir or even Texas Instruments or a leading tech company? What would you want them to learn from your history of this supposed perfect weapon?
One thing is, to your point, that there is no perfect weapon. There is not a perfect weapon. Even one that looks so compellingly like a perfect weapon is not. Another is that, as easy as it may seem, as easy and bloodless and painless and cheap as it may seem to launch a strikes anywhere now, it is not. There is always blowback. It's always exploding somewhere. And even though it may take a month or 6 months or a year for the blowback to manifest, for the people who were wounded by this thing to develop a response, you have to expect that there will be one. And I think the other thing is that, and perhaps it's the biggest thing, is because it is so easy to forget that there are human faces and minds and bodies on the other end of this thing, including a lot of civilian bodies and minds on the other end of this thing, that I hope that the book will sort of bring back in that you are hurting people, that there's, regardless of how precise this thing is, if you launch a war someplace, especially a place far away that you don't have a lot of intelligence or understanding of, you don't necessarily know who the good guys or the bad guys are. And regardless, they are people, and you are building a weapon that is going to, even if it does save a pilot, is going to kill someone. And it's not going to be perfect, and there's going to be blowback. So I think the overarching lesson, and this sounds a little woolly, but I think this actually can be meaningful, is humility and consciousness of what it looks like on the other end.
Yeah, I don't think it's woolly. It's kind of Kantian to suggest that we humans are crooked, and there's a crookedness not just in our goodness, but in our evil and our weapons. That seems to be the story of The Warhead by Jeffrey Stern. Congratulations, Jeff, on the book. It's an important contribution to a morally complex and importantly morally complex subject that we all look for simple solutions. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for having me.